To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Tonight, let's just turn the page and go to 75, and we'll continue with that second full verse on that page. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects. With supreme faith, I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. And go forward to either 97 or 98, depending on the version of the prayer book you have. For the short mandala offering, do that verse with the offering mantra that's on 98 after it, and then continue with refuge and bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam Chanchu Bardu Dakni Kyapsuchi Daki Chunyan Gi Pesonamgi Drola Benchir Sangye Druparshu Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam Chanchu Bardu Dakni Kyapsuchi Daki Chunyan Gi Pesonamgi Drola Benchir Sangye Druparshu. You can set the prayer books aside till the end of class. We'll do a short meditation before we get class started. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit using the breath as an anchor, as a meditation object. Then after a few minutes of silent meditation on the breath, I'll lead you in short reflection to set your motivation for being here tonight. So again, just use whatever technique is suitable for your mind in terms of working with the breath. I'll ring the chime to begin that meditation period. So now let's set our motivation and recall how in the 12 links of dependent origination, the presentation that Nagarjuna gave us in chapter 26, the very first link was this link of ignorance, which, as you might recall, is not just a not knowing the nature of reality, but more importantly, a misknowing, a mistaken knowledge. We think that we ourselves and all phenomena exist from their own side, exist intrinsically, inherently, substantially, objectively. Due to that ignorance and the clinging to a self in particular, this person that we are so attached to, we then engage in harmful states of mind that produce karma, and often that manifests in the form of physical and verbal actions. And we exacerbate our own suffering by virtue of being grounded in that ignorance. All of our actions, all of our thoughts that are together with that ignorance only create results that are within samsara, that are within the 12 links. So when we come to these teachings, as we're going to be doing tonight and looking at chapter 18, where Nagarjuna presents the view of the self, how to examine the self and come to understand exactly how we ourselves exist and refute this mistaken way that we think things exist. In particular, again, the self, the person, ourselves. It's important that we generate the best motivation for doing this work, to recognize that while this knowledge is essential to attain our own liberation, to be free of not just our ignorance, but all the delusions that are built on our ignorance, all the karma that arises from that, while we can strive to have that liberation for ourselves, this isn't the final goal. We should ideally be seeking this knowledge, coming to understand the emptiness of the self, so that we can attain Buddhahood, so that we can help all sentient beings to be free from everything that obscures their minds, to help them to know their true potential by completely actualizing our own potential. Becoming a Buddha ourselves, we then will be best qualified to lead others to that same state. So within the context of these thoughts, generate that sincere motivation of bodhicitta, that aspiration to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, and think that it's with this motivation that you're engaging in these teachings on emptiness tonight. Okay, so before I go into chapter 18, I did introduce it briefly and towards the end of last week's class, but let me just make sure that there were no questions from the 12 links of dependent origination, chapter 26. Again, the import of looking at it, and again, this is, we're following His Holiness the Dalai Lama's order that he uses in the book called The Middle Way, when he gave teachings on this text as the preliminary teachings for the Kalachakra in 2004 in Toronto. And so he put this schema together that works really quite nicely. Chapter 26 shows us what our situation is and explains the whole concept of things arising in dependence upon other factors, which is how things exist conventionally. This is the way that conventional truth only exists, is by virtue of dependence upon other factors, whether it be dependence upon causes and conditions, upon parts, or upon mere imputation, the subtlest way that things exist. But anyway, the main teaching behind chapter 26 is to show us that as long as we're under the control of this ignorance, we're only going to create the causes for continuing in samsara. Once we break that ignorance, completely do away with that ignorance, then we can be free from all of that, attain the state of nirvana, peace, and of course, the state of Buddhahood that would follow from that with the bodhicitta motivation. So the idea behind all of this is that we have to have this wisdom realizing emptiness. So then His Holiness very skillfully goes right into chapter 18. Now again, prior to chapter 18 and even for a few chapters after, there's a lot of discussion of emptiness. The whole text, is pretty much a laying out of the reasonings that help us to understand that things lack intrinsic existence based on Nagarjuna's interpretation of the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So essentially, this chapter 18 is the only one that deals quite specifically with the person, with the self that we once more are rotating around, revolving around, this strong sense of self that drives so much of our actions, our thoughts. This is what is at the root of all of our problems, because we can see that the phenomenal world around us doesn't become problematic unless we start having our personal relationship with it, unless we start clinging to things as mine and having this whole conflict with others on the basis of myself and someone else, other beings. So all of the conflict in the world, all of the misery in the world arises from this clinging to a self, clinging to a person that doesn't exist in reality. Now the self does exist, but again, only as a dependent origination, only as something that arises in dependence upon causes and conditions, parts, and in the end, mere designation, mere imputation. This is what I went through at Sunday's teachings when we talked about emptiness in terms of it being necessary to realize emptiness, even for self-liberation. But again, in this context, we're trying to move it beyond that to look at it as the cause for Buddhahood as well. When we take that wisdom of emptiness and unite it with bodhicitta, motivation, we have the two wings of the bird that allow us to fly all the way to enlightenment, the wing of wisdom and the wing of compassion or method. And both of those in tandem will produce the result of Buddhahood. So when I introduced this last week, I did talk a little bit about how when we go through this, there are going to be places where we talk about self, and we need to qualify which self we are referring to, because self can be used in Buddhism to refer to the mere I, the self that does exist, which is this conventionally existent, conventional truth. Every one of you exists. Without a doubt, you exist. Don't think you don't exist. You can't get out of it that easy. You will continue to exist. And there is always going to be some level of an imputation of an I on the basis of having aggregates. Aggregates being the 5 components of a being that the Buddha spoke to as being a way of looking at our experience. Their form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness. The last four are essentially mind, all the various facets of mind. And the first one, form, is body. So we can say mind and body complex. This is the basis upon which we have this thought of I. That's the only way that the self or the I exists, is as a thought and a designation to this collection of stuff, this mind-body complex. There's no more existence than that, mere nominal existence. The self that we often use when we use the word selflessness, for example, when we say that the I is selfless, is referring to the fictitious self that we think exists inherently, that we think exists again from its own side by way of its own characteristics, self-established. And Lama Zopa, when he teaches on this, of course, he just uses the word real, the real I. Why? Because that's how we think of it, as being real. Our sense of reality is always together with that level of ignorance. What is there that is the real self, if you pull it down to that bare level, is what I just was speaking to, the mere I. There's nothing more than that. So another terminology that's going to come up in our commentary as we go through this is this idea of the view of the transitory collection. I may have even mentioned it when we went through the 12 links, because I mentioned that if you go back to the chart that I did for that chart 1, the very first link, it's described there as this ignorance refers to the misconception of the person, specifically oneself, as inherently existent. It does not refer to the ignorance that occurs throughout a lifetime, but to the one period, even just a few moments before, committing an action that propels you. Anyway, the idea is that this is a ignorance that is specifically around the person. The view of the transitory collection is another name for this ignorance. Because this ignorance, you can have this fictitious view of all phenomena, everything that exists. So sometimes we talk about the selflessness of persons and the selflessness of phenomena. And by that we mean phenomena that are other than persons. But why we isolate this one out is because of what I just explained. This strong view that we're holding to as the person as being inherently existent is driving the whole show. It's what's keeping the whole thing going. This is what all the great masters of the past have recommended, that you realize the selflessness of the person first, because it is at the root of all of our suffering. And it's something that, again, we are quite familiar with in terms of the person is, this view of the person is with us all the time. We already have some suspicions even perhaps about the self of persons. Even the lower Buddhist schools refute some level of selflessness, or of some level of existence of the self, the person, in regard to what's causing the problems of samsara. So we're going to go into that a little bit more detail, but this view of the transitory collection, it's called a view because it is specifically a way of looking at something that is erroneous, in this case because it's one of the afflicted views. When we set out and we did all this kind of analysis of the minds and mental factors earlier this year, this is one of what we call the 5 afflicted views. And those 5 afflicted views are summarized into afflicted view, and they're part of the 6 root afflictions. These being a part of the 51 mental factors that we studied when we did that text. So this is one of the main delusions that we're working with, is this view of the transitory collection. I'm not going to go into the other views so much. One of them is extreme views, which we've talked about, alluded to here and there. These 2 extremes of either permanence, existence on the one hand, which is referring to the inherent existence, and then nihilistic views over on the other side, where we believe in kind of an annihilation of the self. So this middle way that we're finding between these two extremes is the one that helps us to refute any inherent existence. So one of the ways that we talk about this view of inherent existence is this view of the transitory collection. So what it is doing is, this is a thought process we have in our minds where we are looking at, although it seems to say that it's a view of the transitory collection, meaning this impermanent, changing collection of stuff that is the basis for the person. It technically is not looking at that. It's not looking at the aggregates. It's looking at the I that is imputed on the aggregates. And it is holding that I to be inherently existent, meaning that there is something among the aggregates that can be identified as being the I, or something apart from them, but essentially it is trying to find something that is real, that is substantial, that can be identified as the I. But the view of the transitory collection doesn't question this, obviously. The view of the transitory collection just holds to this strong sense of I and keeps perpetuating it. But again, why the Buddha isolated this in particular to talk about it is because it's a subset of the ignorance that is adhering to inherent existence that is the most important view for us to refute. That this strong grasping at this sense of I is behind the whole mess of samsara that we've been in since beginningless time. So this view, again, is observing the I that is simply designated to this collection of stuff and thinking that I exists inherently, truly, from its own side. Again, all these synonyms of the object of refutation, as we call it. So this is the view that we're trying to refute in particular in this chapter. This chapter is intended to target that view, whereas the rest of the chapters we're mostly looking at refuting the ignorance that is grasping at the inherent existence of other phenomena, actions, movement, motion, all these various things that Nagarjuna spends the remaining chapters looking at, the previous chapters looking at, to try to refute that any of these could exist inherently. Then in chapter 18 is where he finally approaches the whole concept of the person, the I, the self, that is merely imputed, but that we think is much more than that we think is inherently existent. So this is the context for this chapter. And obviously, again, in His Holiness's presentation, it makes absolute sense, having looked at the 12 links and coming to understand that the main problem right from the beginning, the first link, is this view of the transitory collection. Therefore, as we saw in the very end of this chapter 26, let me get out the verses here. We can even maybe read those again just to refresh our memory. Let's read 26:10 through 12 on that page 8 of your text. Does anyone need a copy of the text? Everyone's okay. Do you need one? Yeah, I think I've got one down here. Anyone else? A couple more? Okay. Send them back that way to Todd and Tony. Victor needs one too. Are there enough for everybody? Okay, Todd needs one too again. Okay. All right, so again, this is on the very last page. The root of cyclic existence is action. Therefore, the wise do not act. The unwise one is an agent. The wise one, seeing suchness, is not. When ignorance has ceased, actions will not arise. Ignorance ceases through insight into and meditation on suchness. Through the cessation of this and that do not manifest. In this way, the entire mass of suffering ceases completely. So this is the whole idea, is that if we are able to see into the reality of suchness, which is another term for emptiness, selflessness, there's the thusness, lots of different ways that it's kind of expressed. The idea is that it's how things actually exist. That's why it's called their suchness. They are such. They exist in this way, lacking any inherent existence. The term emptiness is used because it's referring to the negation of that things don't have inherent existence. But any of these terms are referring to that same reality, the reality of how things actually exist that the Buddha taught, that is important to breaking the whole chain. Once we remove that ignorance, everything that is built on that ignorance topples. There's no more support for it. ignorance, you won't give rise to contaminated actions any longer. The contaminated actions won't be imprinted on the consciousness. You won't give rise to name and form and the 6 sense sources and all of the things that follow. All 12 links will come to an end once one has gotten completely rid of ignorance. So this is why, again, we're moving into chapter 18. After chapter 18, just as a preview, His Holiness will go on to chapter 24, which explains the Four Noble Truths, which is kind of the context for seeing how both conventional truth that we saw in chapter 26 and ultimate truth that we're seeing in chapter 18 fit together in a completely complementary way within the schema of the Four Noble Truths. So exciting stuff. All right, so let's, we're not going to read the verse yet, because I do have a little bit of preliminary stuff that Tsongkhapa talks about that I am going to share with you. If you do have Ocean of Reasoning with you and have access to that, then you might open it up to the beginning of this chapter. This chapter is essentially divided into, it's kind of got 3 main parts, but the last 2 parts aren't really with verses or anything, and they're more sutra citations and things. I'm not sure even how much I'll go through that. The main topic that is being talked about in this chapter is the mode of engaging with things as they really are, again, in particular in regard to the self. So we're going to look at first establishing the view of the way things really are, and refuting then after that the inherent existence of the self, and going through the analysis that Nagarjuna puts forward. So essentially what I want to do is begin by reading this one part that is about establishing the view of the way things really are, this main topic of this chapter. This is page 370 of Ocean of Reasoning. Tsongkhapa says, here someone might ask, if such things as the afflictions and actions, karma, are like such things as a city of Gandharvas, not existing in reality, even though they appear to fools to exist in reality, then what is the way that things really are? And how does one engage with things as they really are? To completely eliminate all grasping of inner and outer phenomena as the self, meaning as an inherently existent self and inherently existent identity, and as that which belongs to the self, respectively, through not objectifying inner and outer phenomena, is to see the way things really are. The details of the mode of engagement with the way things really are should be understood as is explained in the Madhyamakavatara, Chandrakirti's text, through statements such as this: seeing through wisdom that all of the afflictions and their faults arise from the view objectifying the transitory aggregates, realizing that the self is the object of this view, the practitioner refutes such a self. So in that verse, we have just what I was talking about, that Chandrakirti is saying that seeing that all of what we were talking about through the 12 links arises on the basis of the view of the transitory collection, what was called here the view objectifying the transitory aggregates, the view that makes the self into an inherently existent self fallaciously, incorrectly. Realizing that the self is the object of this view, here it's referring then to that fictitious self, the fabricated self. Realizing that this fabricated self is the object of this view, the object of that conception, the practitioner rejects such a self, refutes such a self. Comes to understand the lack of existence of that self, that it doesn't exist at all. There is no inherently existent I. So then he goes on to the explanation. But another way of looking at this, I sometimes like to use the analogy of why it's so important to refute this object that we are adhering to. If you had a young child who was frightened, maybe they saw a movie that frightened them or something, and they started imagining that there was a monster in their room. They couldn't sleep at night. They would wake up with nightmares and being really afraid and being, terrified of a monster that they thought was living in their room. Well, it would pain you, right, to see this child going through such unnecessary suffering because there's no monster in the room. And there's no monster in the room, but the child doesn't know there's no monster in the room. So in this scenario, the Buddha is like the kind parent that knows that there's no monster in the room, and we're like the young children that are fictitiously believing in this monster. And all of our fear, all of our delusion, all of our problems are coming from this adherence to that existing. So we have to, just as in this case of the young child, you have to refute the existence of the monster in the room, right? You can't just tell them, there's no monster in the room. There's no monster in the room. I mean, maybe with some children that might work. You have to do an analysis. You have to actually show that there's no monster in the room. So what you would do as a kind parent is you would go into the room at night before the child went to bed, and you'd bring your big flashlight and you'd shine it into all the corners of the room and into the closet and under the bed and wherever else there might be a monster, to show the child that there's no monster. And maybe it doesn't work the first time, but eventually the child comes to understand that there's no monster in the room and can finally be free of the misconception that there's a monster in the room. So it's exactly the same with us. It's a bit more complicated because we obviously have this deeply ingrained in us. It's not just something that's been generated over the course of a few days or weeks. This is ignorance we've had since beginningless time. So we need to have a tool, a flashlight, to kind of show us how things really are, to refute the self that the view of the transitory collection is adhering to, as if it were real, grasping at this object as if it has substantial reality, when in fact it doesn't have that at all. So the tools that Nagarjuna is going to give us in the very beginning of this is the fundamental refutation that we always use to refute the self of persons. And many of you are already familiar with it, so I'm not going to belabor it, but for those who aren't familiar, I'll certainly give some instruction. So from here we go on then into the refutation of the inherent existence of the self. This is again the main part of this beginning. Then we're going to go on to look at not just the person who is the I that is established in that particular way, but then look at how mine, the sense of a possessor that I is, how that is established as lacking inherent existence as well. So the initial mode of analysis of those who aspire to liberation is the next heading that Tsongkhapa has. This is underneath this refutation of the inherent existence of the self. Tsongkhapa says, this is still before the verses, we'll get to the verses in just a moment. Tsongkhapa says, since the truth of suffering was taught as the first of the Four Noble Truths, when one meditates on the many general and particular evils of cyclic existence, the practitioner aspires to engage with the way things really are, aspires to abandon such disadvantages as birth and death in cyclic existence. Recall that was the 11th and 12th links, which were the culmination of all of that process. We take another birth and so on. And aspires to abandon the afflictions, such as the fault of desire, craving, grasping, which once more were also included in the links as the 8th and 9th links, which cause the ripening of that karmic seed. While so engaged, seeing that without undoing the cause, the effect cannot be eliminated, he then analyzes, thinking, what could be the root of this cyclic existence? On analysis, he sees that the view of the transitory aggregates is the root of cyclic existence, and sees that by abandoning that, all of the afflictions and faults can be eliminated. So this is pretty similar to what we've already said. I think everybody's, based on the things I've already talked about, getting what that page is talking about. However, one might then ask, is the view of the transitory aggregates to be abandoned? How is the view of the aggregates to be view of the transitory aggregates to be abandoned? In general, all of the chapters that we've looked at already undermine the existence of the object that is grasped by erroneous conception. In other words, an inherently existent blank, fill in the blank. Again, action, agent, whatever the case might be. Thereby, the subject's grasping is dispelled. Just as, like I said, with the child, if you show them that there is no monster, then they stop believing in this fictitious monster. Any of these reasonings that we've gone through, they all refute the inherent existence of, again, whatever object is being analyzed. This chapter in particular, Tsongkhapa says, examines the self that is grasped through the view of the transitory aggregates in terms of whether that self is identical to or different from the aggregates. Through dispelling the object, the grasping of the self and being mine is said to be eliminated, because we have those two ways, again, that this is manifesting in terms of the strong sense of I, and then that strong sense of I that becomes a possessor, that thinks of things as being mine. We're not talking about the objects that are possessed in that case. The view of the transitory collection is always a view of the self of persons. It is a self of persons who is simply the I that is established with this identity that we think is inherently there, and it's the view of the sense of mind, the possessor, because once more, that is how this I manifests in terms of the world and the relationship to the people, the objects, and so on in this world. So through dispelling the object, as I said, the grasping of the self and being mine is said to be eliminated. The Katusataka says, this is the 400 verses, I believe. When selflessness is seen in the object, the seed of cyclic existence is destroyed. So when we begin to see that the object we are observing lacks that self, when we see the selflessness of that, then we begin to destroy the seed of cyclic existence, the root of all of our suffering. It thus says that seeing the non-existence of the self that is grasped through self-grasping is necessary for liberation from cyclic existence. The Pramanavartaka says, this is the reasoning text that I think it's Dharmakirti wrote this, I think, yeah. Without eliminating its object, it cannot be eliminated. So without eliminating the object of that ignorance, the ignorance itself cannot be eliminated. Just like once more with the child, without eliminating the object that the child's adhering to, the monster in the room, saying that doesn't exist, you can't get rid of the view that holds to the existence of that. So again, we're kind of talking about two objects of negation in a sense. There's the object of negation that never existed, which is, in the case of the child, the monster in the room. In the case of us, it's the inherently existent I, the truly existent I. That we have to refute the existence of that because we believe it to exist. By virtue of refuting the object of that conception, you refute the misconception itself, which does exist. We do have ignorance, or else we wouldn't have the problems that we're having. Ignorance, once more, is the first link. It drives the whole show. So there are two objects of negation in the Buddhist teachings. One is negated through reasoning, which is the object that we are adhering to that is erroneous, that is fictitious. The object of negation that is the inherently existent I or self. Then we have what's refuted through the path. What is negated through the path is our ignorance. By developing the consciousness, the wisdom that knows emptiness, knows the lack of the inherent existence of that self, of that person, we then know the wisdom of emptiness and have the exact antidote to the ignorance. In this case, the view of the transitory collection. We have everything that completely negates it. So there's two parts to it. Again, there's the object that ignorance is grasping to that never existed, just like the monster never existed. But then there's the ignorance in our minds that is this view of the transitory collection that will be refuted and eliminated when we know the non-existence of the object it's grasping to. So this is, again, the whole process. It's just that he's going into in detail here in particular, because once more, this chapter 18 is really a crucial chapter. We are studying the essence of Nagarjuna's text by looking at these three chapters, because they really do drive home the entire picture of what's going on in this refutation of inherent existence that Nagarjuna is doing. So at the end of that, he says, thus, in this respect, all of the great charioteers have the same idea and speak with the same voice, meaning kind of all of those who have, led the track along understanding the Buddha's wisdom. So let's see, I think I'll read a little bit more of this. There's just about another half a page, and then we get into the verses. It says, therefore, it does not make sense to maintain that one can achieve liberation from cyclic existence by simply becoming accustomed to detaching one's mind from the self and from being mine, without understanding the way the self is grasped through self-grasping and the proper way to use stainless arguments to eliminate the grasped self. So he's essentially saying that it's not enough to just kind of withdraw our minds. Tsongkhapa himself even said that we have three different states of mind. We can be sort of together with the ignorance that adheres to inherent existence, not with that ignorance, or we can actually have the counterpart to that, the opposite, opposing force to that, by understanding things to exist by mere designation, to exist in the very subtle way that they actually do. Currently, we have a lot of moments of ignorance in our minds. It's not enough to simply withdraw from that and think, I'm not going to adhere to this as being inherently existent, because that's not strong enough to overcome the object that we are grasping at. Simply by, and that's why, again, a lot of these great masters in various traditions have used meditative techniques, because when one withdraws one's mind into meditation, the mind can become extremely subtle, so that there's not much conceptual thought going on at all, which means there's not much ignorance operating. So therefore, you would think you can kind of achieve some form of a temporary liberation, and it is some form of liberation, but only temporary. It doesn't get you to the final result. Why? Because that withdrawal from thinking that things inherently exist isn't enough. You have to replace it with the third awareness, which understands things as they actually are, which understands the wisdom of emptiness and has the force behind it to be able to annihilate that ignorance, that view of the transitory collection. So this is just, again, Tsongkhapa giving us this advice. He says, this is because, although through that practice, one does not engage with the object of self-grasping, one does not engage with the object of selflessness. Why? Because we're not getting to the place of not having the ignorance present, but we're not getting to selflessness. We're not getting to emptiness. You're not actually introducing the actual antidote to all of this. You're instead just not participating in that ignorance. Is everybody getting some idea of what this is about? I mean, again, we don't, even in our daily lives, we do have fleeting moments where we don't have our ignorance operative. Probably not that many, because we, again, revolve around this sense of I that we're clinging to so tightly. And everything that we relate to with some subtle level of ignorance. As I mentioned in Sunday's class, that's partly because everything appears to inherently exist. These are the subtle imprints that we have from this ignorance since beginningless time that cause what are called the knowledge obstructions, the obstructions to omniscience. They cause things to appear as if they have their own mode of existence from their own side, that they're self-established, and we adhere to that false appearance. So we have two problems going on there too. We've got the ignorance that is falsely grasping at that, and then we have the appearance as if it exists that way. So we think we're totally legit in adhering to that because that's how things appear. That's why I think it's particularly difficult to remove this ignorance, is because we're being reinforced by everything that we observe, everything that appears to our consciousness, not just our conceptual mind, but our senses as well. Everything appears as if it's established on its own. So then we just simply adhere to that with our conceptual mind. With this view of the transitory collection, we particularly adhere to the self, the person, as existing in that way. So without getting engaged in the wisdom that realizes the refutation of all of that, there's no way, even though we might temporarily withdraw from that through meditation or other techniques, where we're not actively having the ignorant mind or the view of the transitory collection, we're still going to have those within our minds because we haven't engaged in the antidote. We haven't actually done what's necessary to remove that ignorance. So he continues, he says, therefore, that practice can never undermine self-grasping at all. If it could, then in order to meditate on the way things really are, there would be no need to develop the non-erroneous view. It would follow that all of the explanations of how things really are in the treatises and sutras would be purposeless and meaningless. You know, everything the Buddha taught me, everything we're doing here tonight wouldn't serve a purpose because it would be enough to simply learn meditative techniques or some way of being able to withdraw from having that ignorance active in your mind. But it's not enough. We have to go the full distance. Nor should it be said that although it is necessary to develop this view at the stage of hearing and contemplation, this is not necessary at the stage of meditation. What he's talking about here are the three wisdoms that most of you are familiar with. The wisdom that arises from hearing, which is what's going on in your minds now as you're hearing me go blah, 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 and reading Nagarjuna's words, whatever. All of that is coming in at just simply the level of listening, but there's already some wisdom there. You know, because it's not that the words are just going in one ear and out the other, hopefully. That's not happening. You're not like that pot that's got the hole in the bottom that everything's just draining through. There's some words coming in and registering some meaning with you. Just that is wonderful. That's a step up from where we're at in terms of our ignorance. But that wisdom of hearing isn't enough. We have to continue to reflect upon emptiness. We have to do contemplation, as was used here. The term was the wisdom of contemplation or thinking. This is what mostly our meditative, analytical meditation is right now. Most of us are engaged in some form of analytical meditation on the long rim. On emptiness in particular, it's a way of becoming familiar with it through using all the tools that we're examining here and becoming more and more familiar with the correct view of emptiness. But that isn't enough. We have to also practice in the same way and accomplish the wisdom of meditation. The wisdom of meditation is when we actually have the foundation of a very stable mind, the mind of calm abiding or higher. You know, some of those concentrations I mentioned earlier in this course, or formless absorptions, but generally one of the concentrations or calm abiding. And observing emptiness, we develop this union of calm abiding and special insight, this mind that's very penetrative and eventually achieves deeper realizations and eventually the direct realization that will cause ignorance to be eliminated gradually until it's completely dispelled. So the idea here is that somebody might put forth the view, and I don't know who this would be, that although it's necessary to use this view in the first two stages, the wisdom from hearing and contemplation or thinking, reflection, it's not necessary in the third stage, which sounds very strange to me, but I guess, I don't know. So he says, Tsongkhapa, of course, refutes this. This is because that very thing which has been established through hearing and contemplation is for the purpose of familiarizing the mind with the view at the stage of meditation. And because the practitioner rejects such a self means that the practitioner does that through meditation. So we actually carry over all of that. Your learning that you do through hearing, through your own private investigation, reflection, contemplation, eventually matures into the wisdom that arises from meditation. There's no difference in the object that you are observing and the process that needs to be engaged in. You have to do that through the entire process of developing your wisdom. Last paragraph, he says, thus the practitioner, seeing that the abandonment of the view of the transitory aggregates depends on establishing the essencelessness of the object as grasped by it, by that view, and also seeing that its object is the self, at the very beginning analyzes the self, inquiring as to whether or not the self, the object of self-grasping, exists inherently. So in all those uses of the self that I just said, that was all the mistaken sense of self, the imputed sense of self that is not there at all, not the mere self that exists or the mere I that exists simply by designation. Again, the view of the transitory aggregates is observing that mere I that we impute on all of this and thinking there is some reality to it that is fictitious, a reality that is its inherent existence, its substantial existence, and so on. So this was Tsongkhapa's way of kind of framing this, getting into what we're going to be doing in terms of these verses. So let's go ahead and go to the verses, and then I'll continue for about another half hour or so, and then we'll see if there are any questions so far. Let's read just the first two lines of the first verse of chapter 18. If self were the aggregates, it would have arising and disintegration. So just one more little thing to frame what we're going to be doing in this first verse, because this first verse, you'll see that we go on then in the next two lines to say, if it were different from the aggregates. We have these two ideas that either we're going to find, if there is an inherently existent self, if this person exists in the way that this self-grasping thinks it exists, once more, that object we're trying to refute, that sense of an inherently existent I, if that really does exist, it's either going to be the same as, one with, this collection of stuff, what we call the aggregates or the mind-body complex, or some part of it. You're going to be able to find something that is the I in a real way among all of this, or you're going to find it as totally separate, completely different. This is a dichotomy. There's no third possibility. The traditional reasoning that most of you in the room are familiar with, that this is the root for, is first of all, it's a fourfold reasoning, analyzing the self of persons. We first of all identify the object of negation, which is kind of what Tsongkhapa was doing to some degree at the beginning, saying what is the object that ignorance, that view of the transitory collection is holding to? What is this sense of an inherently existent I? Again, as I said, Lama Zopa, he uses the term the real I. But it's so mixed with the mere I that it's very hard for us to get an idea of it. What the great masters of the past have said is that we need to conjure up those experiences we've had where the I has felt very concrete, very solid, very real. Usually those are times when the I has felt somewhat threatened or had a strong sense of emotion. They often encourage you to think about times when you've been falsely accused, when someone has said that you did something and you're like, no, I didn't, right? You have that strong sense of this clinging to an I. When I conjure up that in my own meditation, it feels like the I is kind of right here in the center of my chest, but you might have a different experience around that. It feels almost like a physical phenomenon as well. But if you've ever had an experience where you maybe were in an accident and almost died or something, you ever had that real quick flash of like, oh my gosh, this could be it. The strong sense of I that you could conjure up there, not to relive the emotion. This isn't the whole purpose of this meditation. this first step isn't to like get all emotional and fearful on the meditation cushion. It's to bring to mind what the I felt like at that time, seemed like at that time, how you were grasping it at that time. Because that's the sense of real I that we're trying to refute. Now, again, it's not to say that it isn't present with other emotions and other gradations of emotions. It's just that it's more prominent then. You know, it's more noticeable. We can see it and pick it out and go, oh, there's that sense of I. And you might need to conjure that up on occasion doing this type of meditation to make sure that you've got the right target that you're aiming at in terms of that sense of I. Because if you refute too much, then you could fall into that extreme of nihilism and annihilate the I entirely. But if you don't refute enough, you're going to keep holding on to some sense of inherent existence. That's why this idea of finding the middle way between these two extremes is so crucial. We have to find the right object of negation to begin with. And all the teachers I've had have said, if you identify this correctly, you do the first step correctly, the rest of it is a breeze. I mean, in terms of once you know what it is that you're looking for, the strong sense of I. And I think some of us, again, are afraid to go to that degree, you know, in terms of what we are really refuting. Because we have such conviction in the sense of a real I. And we are somewhat afraid that if we refute that, we're not going to exist at all, or there's going to be some nihilistic bent to it. I mentioned this previously in another class. I don't know if I mentioned it here, but Jampa Gendon, who was the teaching assistant at the master's program, he said he heard Lama Yeshe say once that for Westerners, because we have such a strong grasping at the I, better to head for a complete nihilistic view and then just dial it back a little, you know, because we just have such strong adherence to the sense of I. You know, just gets reified by virtue of what we do with our culture. And he called this super samsara, you know, the West. You know, we've kind of taken samsara to a whole new level, you know, and all these things that kind of reinforce the strong sense of self, right? So much of this identification that we have, which is, again, that second aspect of the view of the transitory collection, the mine, M-I-N-E, that clinging to things as being mine, that strong possessor nature of the self. So again, this is the context for this is that then after that first step of identifying the object of negation, this fictitious object of negation that is grasped at by our ignorance, once we identify that sense of an inherently existent I, we then determine what are the possibilities. If this does exist, if I can find the true referent of that, something that is the object that that term refers to, that concept is grasping at, if I can find that real I, what are the possibilities? As I said, it's either going to be together with this stuff, which is the most likely one, right? Because this is where we have the strong sense of an I, is when we're together with our body and mind, which is all the time pretty much, right? And I don't know, some people have a sense of an out-of-body experience or something, but nonetheless, this is where it's most likely to be found because we have that strong clinging on the basis of these aggregates. But we have to include the other possibility, that there is something different from the aggregates, completely apart from the aggregates, that is that real I. So the second step is sometimes called establishing the pervasion or the possibilities. The idea is we have to determine the possibilities for that I to exist in that way, that real I, that real self. And this too is a dichotomy. It either is going to be here with all of this or not here, the same as or different from. Is there a third possibility? If something exists,
could it be both?
How could it be both, Mark? I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Okay. You know, if I think about who am I, okay, there's all kinds of stuff. There's my body, my memories, my the things I'm grasping for, the things I hate. There's just this whole range of stuff that I've gathered together. So there could, who knows what else there could be for them.
I guess we have to go back to the idea, though. Mark was just, for those who are online, saying, you know, when he thinks of the sense of I, there's a whole wide array of things that can be thought of as I in terms of different emotions, different thoughts, what have you, the body, whatever. Well, that in and of itself is speaking to what we're talking about, that we cannot find something that is identical to that real I, because if we think about the real I, it's unitary. we don't think of there being 2 eyes here, or 5 eyes here, or 10 eyes here, or 1,000,000 eyes here. We think there is 1 eye here. There's one self, one person. And that clinging to that strong sense of an I involves that unitariness. So when we are looking for a true referent in this type of analysis, we're not talking about a conventional analysis where I would say, where are you, Mark? Oh, I'm here. Well, then that's fine. I can see you. There's Mark over there. That's just a conventional way for Mark to be identified, and it doesn't involve any ignorance necessarily. But then when I go, but where is Mark really? Where is Don really? Where is this I really? Then we're doing a deeper analysis, and we have to look at how that object that we are clinging to with ignorance, what are the qualities of that? And one of the qualities of it is that it is unitary. It doesn't have a sense of duality or, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 things to it. It has the sense of it being unitary. This actually comes into the consequences that we're going to see if we equate it to the aggregates, because we have a sense of a oneness, but we have 5 aggregates. So how can we have 5 aggregates and yet have 1 I and have them be equivalent? There would be 5 I's at least, or there'd be only 1 aggregate. Because this is a deeper form of analysis, an ultimate kind of analysis. But even what you're saying, Mark, does show how difficult it is to find something that we can pinpoint that is the I in all ways, that is self-established as the I, that is equivalent to this sense of I. And by these uses of the I, I'm referring to that false sense of self, that inherently existent self. You can go looking for the mere I too. Rinpoche points this out often in his teachings, but there's not much point in it because the mere I also cannot be found to inherently exist because it's merely imputed. It's only nominally existent. But that's not touching the object of negation. What we have to do is, in this first step, get really clear about the sense of I as it appears when ignorance is operative, when we have that strong clinging to the sense of I. And how that feels, how that looks, what that object is like, that is this sense of I, is what we're trying to find as existing the same as the aggregates or different from the aggregates. Can we find that concrete sense of I that we're clinging to so tightly? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, another way that's commonly looked at it, if you go back to the traditional Christianity, we say that our I is our soul. And usually when we think of our soul, we think of something that's distinct from the aggregates.
Right.
And so it goes more back to the sense that when you say, oh, this is my body, I own it. So we think of something like our souls having ownership of our body and mind and so forth.
Right.
So that, I think that's the sense of the I being other than the 5 aggregates.
Right. Yeah, which is, Bob was just pointing out for those at home, this idea that is the kind of initial refutation that the Buddha did in the sense of what was called an Atman, or translated usually as a soul in the Vedic traditions, which is, thought of as sort of being the person, the I, in a more lasting way. But that's often described as kind of being permanent. It is unitary, and it is independent. It does have no causes and conditions involved in it, but it is permanent and unchanging. It's sort of this sense. And of course, some of us grew up in Western traditions that are also deeply rooted in this idea of a soul. But the Buddha said there is no such soul. But this is where some of these misconceptions can come in. We can acquire them in this life by people telling us that there is this phenomenon called the soul, that is the self, that is completely independent of the aggregates. It's completely different from the aggregates. You don't find the soul to be equivalent to the mind, nor do you find it to be equivalent to the body. So this is also one of the aspects that we're going to look at in regard to that second set of lines in verse 1. But essentially, in this second part is where you determine what are the possibilities. And so again, to Mark's question, can it be both the same and different? Well, that would be contradictory, because if it's something that is the same as and different from, it would be like a cow is the same as a horse and different from a horse. It doesn't make sense, right? Or a cow is the same as a cow and different from a cow. Those don't logically work for something to be both the same and different. It just doesn't fall into, because again, what we're looking for is a unitary phenomenon that we can find, isolate, identify, that is this inherently existent I, that is this truly existent I. So after having done the second step, which is a necessary part of our sort of logical proof, we then go on to the two alternatives, the two possibilities. we try to determine if that real I that is the first step that we've identified, is it equivalent to the same as something in this collection of stuff? And then we do the final analysis. Is it something that we can find that is other than this stuff, the aggregates? And if we don't find it in either place, because the second step told us that those were the only two possibilities, well, then we've refuted it. We've come to understand that it doesn't exist at all. Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I was just going to point out when you say that it can't be both the same and different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the crucial part of that is it has to be a single thing.
Right.
Because if it could be a complex of several parts,
Mm-hmm.
then it could be both the same and different. Because one part could be the same and the other part could be different. So it's when it has to be a single thing that it's impossible to be both at the same time.
Right. Okay. I guess so. Do you have an example of what we would? What Bob was saying, that yeah, it's the whole idea of it being unitary that really brings that to the point of it can't be both same and different. But I think there's also a contradiction in that. I don't know, but
Yeah, it is a contradiction. If it's a single thing, then it can't be both the same identity and different. But if it's a complex made up of parts, then one part can be identified.
But
with one part, the other part can be
if it was a
identified.
multiple phenomenon,
Yeah,
like what
or
they use
multiple.
in the like I say, a pot and a pillar, is kind of one of the traditional ones they use in Tibetan debate, So then if you have a multiple phenomenon.
Well, it's the same way, we say that we think of ourselves as having a mind and body.
Right.
So you can say, well, we can be both mind and body. Because part of ourself is a mind, part of ourself is a body, so we can be both. And
Right.
but if you're saying I can only be one thing, then either I have to be mind or I have to be body. I can't, it's when you separate yourself that you can be several things simultaneously.
Which, yeah.
Yeah. You can identify one part with one thing, and the other part with the other thing.
Yeah, I guess again, in this context, we would never have that possibility, but I guess there would be phenomena that could be established, like I was saying, a pot and pillar, where you could find something that is different from and something that is the same as on the basis of that. But anyway. Okay, so this is the context for this analysis is what we often in our meditation, we do this 4-point analysis. How many of you in the room have done the fourfold analysis, the 4-point analysis? I'm sure most of you have done it, yes? Hands up, I don't know. It's one of the classic ways that it's taught in all the Lam-Rim texts, all the stages of the path texts, it teaches this in terms of the selflessness of persons. There are some times when, for the selflessness of phenomena, they approach it from different angles. But nonetheless, it's a really important technique to use, because in our meditation, we can go through these 4 steps and come to loosen up that strong sense of a self. You might not have everything, falling into place, a complete perfect view of emptiness the first time you do it, but you'll at least start to get an idea for how elusive this sense of self is. If the self existed in the way that we think it does, when our ignorance is operated, when the view of the transitory collection is operative, then we would be able to find it right away, right? You would think it would be quite evident. You would go, there it is, because that's the level that we believe in. That's the degree to which we are convinced that the I exists. But when you begin to do that analysis, we see that it doesn't have that at all. We can't find it. And so it starts loosening up that strong sense of self. What we're going to do, we've talked about some ideas after this class. Maybe I shouldn't be advertising already, but when we finish this survey of Nagarjuna's text, these 3 chapters, we're talking about maybe doing something that's a little more based on meditation on Wednesday nights. I know it's hard in the evenings to do meditation, but to work with these same concepts using a structure I did for a course at Vajrapani earlier this year, looking at selflessness and doing meditations on it and so on. And that way kind of get more experiential around it, because this is mostly me going blah, 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 but I'm hoping that all of you take this information and use it outside of this class. Certainly in Discovering Buddhism, I can forward to you, meditation that is put together for studying emptiness in that series that you can use that goes through the 4-point analysis. But as I said, in any Lam-Rim text, pretty much all of them that I can think of have that as a structure for looking at refuting this object of the view of the transitory collection, this sense of an inherently existent I. Okay. So now we are kind of in a sense at step 3. And we've already identified the object of negation, come to understood it through, all of the things that we've been looking at. We've determined that there are two possibilities. If we're going to find this real I, this unitary, independently existing I, we have to find it either among the aggregates, the same as, and so on, or completely different from, distinct from the aggregates. We're in the third step here then, in terms of this verse, coming to the conclusion that if the aggregates were the self in an inherently existent way, if the self were the aggregates, if they were equivalent in all ways, then it would have arising and disintegration. It would have to arise and cease. So let's look at what Tsongkhapa says in regard to this, because there are actually even more consequences. Remember that the view that we're discussing here as the correct view is what's called the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school. That's because they use the tool of consequences as a way to help us to generate wisdom. So all of this is set out in terms of the consequence of you holding to this ignorance that thinks that the self is inherently existing and equivalent to the aggregates. The consequence is that the self would have to arise and cease in the same way that the aggregates arise and cease. So let's look at what Tsongkhapa says in regard to that. But as I said, there are many more consequences that we could look at. If the self, Tsongkhapa says, this is page 372 at the bottom, if the self, the object of self-grasping, existed inherently, one could not escape two alternatives regarding its mode of existence. Thus, we should analyze to determine whether it, through its own characteristic, is identical to or different from the aggregates. Exactly what I was just introducing in terms of that. Of identity and non-identity, when one is eliminated, the other is affirmed by that elimination. So he's saying, if you do find that it is identified and equivalent with the aggregates, then you've eliminated that it's not. If you find that it is not, then you've eliminated that it is. This is just basics of logic. If you negate something, then say something doesn't exist, then you have affirmed its non-existence and gotten rid of its existence. Anyway, you get the point of what I'm saying. So thus, the third possibility is excluded. There's no third possibility. It either is or it isn't. And if, in this case, it's either the same as or different. And if we find that it is not the same as and not different from, well, then we don't have a third possibility. We are completely free of that. According to such an analysis, here's where we go with this verse, verse 1. If the self and the aggregates had the same nature through their own characteristics, the self would have to be arising and ceasing at each moment, because the aggregates arise and cease at each moment. The self is not maintained to be like that by the other schools, nor can our own schools maintain it to be that way, because if the self, which is the basis on which the thought I am arises, were identical to the aggregates through its own characteristic, not just, again, in a cursory way, but in this specific way, existing through their own characteristic, then it would even be identical to the aggregates of this life. In that case, the self would have arisen in this life despite not having existed in other lives. And so life would have a beginning. So the idea is that if you have an arising of the aggregates, when did your aggregates start? The aggregates of this life. Well, according to our 12 links of dependent origination, right, they started at the moment of conception. When we had birth, when we had, through the force of our karma, we appropriated new aggregates. When that karma from some other lifetime, or perhaps earlier in this lifetime or the previous lifetime, ripened at the end of that life, it manifested in terms of producing a new set of appropriated aggregates. So if we say the self and the aggregates are identical, that means they're arising and ceasing at the same time, meaning that all the processes that go through of every change that happens to the aggregates happens to the self. Now, conventionally, we say that's no problem, but we're talking here about an analysis of whether they inherently exist in this way. If they inherently exist in this way, then the self at the end of this life would go out of existence. It would no longer have a self. There would be no I that continues on, that has the consciousness going on to the intermediate state and going on to another existence. It would all come to a conclusion because the aggregates and the self are identical. There's no differentiation between the two. Rowena, were you gonna?
I'm just thinking how fragile the aggregates are.
That they are.
So it's not very nice to totally beg on them.
Yeah, the aggregates are very fragile. This is true. Let me read you a little bit of what Geshe Sopa says in regard to this particular argument, because there are, again, well, maybe let's continue on in Tsongkhapa's, and then I'll go to that. He says here, where was I at? In that case, the self would have arisen in this life despite not having existed in other lives, and so life would have a beginning. This will be discussed further in chapter 27 when we look at the Tathagata. We won't be doing that chapter here, but moreover, in each arising and ceasing, if each arising and ceasing were located at a distinct moment, they would be distinct from one another through their own characteristics. This is the thing, is like if we're talking about things existing from their own characteristics, the whole process of change doesn't even come into play because things can't possibly change. Each distinct moment of the aggregates, and thereby the self, would be completely unrelated to the prior moments or the later moments. You'd have no continuity of self whatsoever. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to have some image of what an inherently existent object would look like.
Yeah.
You know, to me,
That's that first step. Yeah.
To me, I mean, the closest thing is the Christian sense of soul. You know, you've got this eternal soul that you know never changes, is always there. You know, it sort of possesses your body and mind, and it's something that's permanent, exists eternally, and never changes. Whereas our normal body and mind are constantly changing and whatever, so they're different from the soul.
That's Bob was pointing out that in his estimation, the sense of a soul, this kind of permanent owner or possessor, whatever, is kind of a useful tool for him to get at what an inherently existent self is like. But I have to disagree, because I think it's still quite a coarse object of refutation, because what we're talking about here, I think it's really quite subtle, and it is sort of hard to get it. Let's see what Rowena wanted to share some, and then I'll talk a little bit more.
I was thinking about it this morning because the inherent doesn't change. So even the soul is supposed to be able to work its way towards God or something, you know? And an inherent thing cannot take on characteristics outside of it. So it doesn't have any growth potential. It isn't going to disintegrate. It doesn't. So this is what I was saying this morning. I don't know how accurate it is, but it was just one of these things where it's completely impossible.
Right.
You know, and it's the whole thing. I can understand change and all that, but understanding inherent existence is really hard for me. But what is being designated by
Right. Because essentially, Rowena's comments were that, again, this idea of inherent has the connotation of it being unchanging. Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the ways in which the refutation does take place, but that's a characteristic of this sense of an I, or a sense of anything that we are adhering to, that we think has that sort of independent, unchanging, unitary existence. But it's really tricky. It's very hard to get the object of negation. I mean, that's why I said this very first step is so crucial. And we might have to spend years and years and years really fine-tuning it to make sure that we get that exact thing that we are trying to negate. Tsongkhapa himself in the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise, he goes into great detail on this, you know, excruciating detail about how to make sure that we don't have it not far enough so that we once more are falling still into some extreme of existence, but then that not going too far with it. If object is refuted that includes more than what is there, then we might refute just mere existence. I mean, the best way to think of it once more is through these experiences, in my estimation, by thinking about those times when we've had a strong sense of I. And when we think that if this isn't real, what is real, kind of thing. This strong sense of an I that is popping up. It's just really overt. Again, I think it has some of the, to Bob's point, I mean, and what you said, there are some similarities, absolutely, because we still do feel like there is an unchanging quality to it. That's part of it being inherent. We do feel sometimes that it plays the role of owner, but nonetheless, it kind of seems to also have something that is real, that is the object of that. And that's the whole point of it, is that we can't find that substantial reality. The lower schools, I mean, maybe this is, again, what I'm hoping to do with the next course, is to go into a little bit more of the detail of some of these other objects of negation, because traditionally it's taught that there are three main ways that we look at the I. There can be other ways included in there, I suppose, when we start including Svatantrika and what have you. The first one is the courses, what we were just talking about in terms of the Atman. this sense of a permanent, unitary, independent self, which is something that is completely other than the aggregates, which is this soul or some other phenomenon, if you will. This is only an acquired misconception, though, the Buddha says, meaning that you have to be ingrained in the Vedic traditions or Christian traditions or whatever that teach you that this exists. You don't naturally have this. You don't come into this life thinking, I have a soul. Someone has to ingrain that in you. And all of us had, again, who were ingrained into that, had someone else teaching us those tenets, those philosophical points of view. The second one is what's called the refutation of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And this is because the lower schools do see that there is this sense, this gets more into that sense of an owner, where there's like a master or an owner that is in charge of the aggregates. His Holiness the Dalai Lama goes into these in the middle way, and you might read up in there if you're curious about them. But what he essentially uses as an example is if you at your age, and some of you are younger than some of us in the room, but if at your age, if someone were to offer to you, they said, oh, I have this way that I could have you give you a brand new body, that's like a young person's body, we would gladly exchange the old body that we have for this young body, thinking that there is some I that will continue to go on with a new body that kind of owns the body and is willing to say, I'm going to get rid of this body and I'll take this body, thank you very much. And we would do the same with our minds very readily, right? If someone said, our minds are getting a little fuzzy, but what if you could have a new, sharp, model 2020, mind, we would gladly exchange our foggy, cloudy, losing our memory minds for something that is clearer, sharper, what have you. This is that sense of this self-sufficient, substantial existence. As if there's something there that kind of is among the aggregates, but has its own mode of existence. It's still somewhat independent. Jeffrey Hopkins uses the analogy of like a sales team where you have a head salesperson with all the other salespeople. The head salesperson is in charge of the other people, but is still on the sales team. It's not like the first one where you're completely apart from it and totally outside of it. This is some feeling like there's a substantially existent person in here that is controlling all of this, that is in charge of all of this. That's the way that all the lower schools, everyone below Prasangika and Yamaka, thinks that if you refute that, then you're liberated. Prasangika says that's only a coarse form of selflessness. When you refute that, which you can refute, and there are techniques for refuting that, we'll go into that in that other course perhaps. But the idea is that if we get rid of that, we still have this very subtle one, which is the sense of an inherently existent self that we're refuting through this analysis, this sense of a real I, meaning that there is kind of a real referent for that sense of I that makes it, we would still use the word substantial, but by substantial, we mean inherently existent, intrinsically existent, existing on its own, independently, from its own side. This is a much subtler sense of the self. Yes, Philip.
Hey, who's doing the refuting?
The I that does exist, we can say absolutely is doing the refuting, which is the mere I. And it's doing a mere refutation of a mere object of negation. There's nothing more that exists than that.
So when that I finally refutes itself, what's left? Liberation.
Liberate. Well, there still is a continuity. There still is a continuity. So Philip's question, if you didn't hear it on the online, was what is left when one does this refutation, when one achieves that complete annihilation of the ignorance, and there's still a continuity of consciousness, because consciousness will continue to generate more minds, but that consciousness is no longer going through the process that we talked about in the 12 links. It is in a state of peace, a state of nirvana. And of course,
It's a pure consciousness.
well, it's a consciousness that has at least removed the afflictive obscurations. That's what the mere attainment of nirvana is, or just the attainment of nirvana, is the removal of the afflictive obscurations, which is our ignorance and all the delusions that are based on that. And thereby, we don't have the karma can't be activated, nothing will happen to propel us from life to life. What they say happens is at the end of a life, say a practitioner is on the individual vehicle, the Hinayana, and they get to the end of that life and they've attained liberation through the force of their meditation. They've completely removed the afflictive obscurations. They exit this life and their consciousness abides in this solitary peace, this state of nirvana. But eventually they are pulled from that piece. The Buddhas, through whatever force, eventually take them and say, sorry, you haven't done all the work because you haven't removed the knowledge obscurations. So even though you're in a state of nirvana, you haven't attained the final goal. You haven't developed your full potential. And then they enter the Mahayana, the universal vehicle, and they practice the path that leads to their complete enlightenment, their Buddhahood. And then when they attain Buddhahood, the consciousness continues to abide in the form of a Buddha, which is the truth body of a Buddha that is then manifesting in the form bodies to help all sentient beings, and will abide until samsara is emptied and all beings have attained enlightenment. So I don't know. I mean, what happens after that? You got me.
So the Buddha is the permanent aspect.
Well, permanent. We wouldn't use the term that Buddha is a permanent. Buddha is eternal, but our minds are eternal. When we really talk about a Buddha, we're talking about a mind, we're talking about an omniscient mind that then manifests through the force of compassion and all of the power and abilities that the Buddha has developed through the training on the path to help other sentient beings. So all of those form bodies are all, manifestations of this enlightened mind. The enlightened mind continues on, though, as an impermanent phenomenon, a changing phenomenon, and will go on in perpetuity. I mean, again, I don't have any reason to suspect that the Buddha mind would end when all beings are enlightened. It would just be enlightened mind at that point. That would be all that exists. Nice ending. But let me make sure that did I answer everything in regard?
I guess I'm starting to wonder if this is a lot of semantics, because wouldn't some people maybe call that Buddha mind the Atman, or wouldn't some people maybe call that Christ consciousness?
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is if it's a little bit of semantics. People are just labeling that final end game a different name.
Well, it's an interesting question whether it is semantics and it's just different namings of the same phenomenon. But there's different pathways. I mean, certainly what's taught in the Vedic traditions or what's taught in Christianity or any of these other spiritual traditions is not the same as what's taught in Buddhism. The techniques that are taught to realize emptiness are not taught, to the best of my knowledge, in any other traditions outside of the Buddhist schools. So if we say that, I mean, again, I'm not trying to in any way belittle any of these other traditions. I don't know. I don't know that we can make them equivalent and just say it's semantics. I would say that's a bit of a reach from my understanding, but
well, not on the technique. I'm just saying the end game, the final goal.
And again, I just can't speak to that because I don't know that I completely understand the end goal of all the other traditions. I don't even know if I completely understand the end goal of the Buddhist tradition. Let's see, June had her hand up first, and then Bob. Yeah.
No, I was just wondering. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. All right. In the end game, is there one Buddha mind, or are all these Buddha minds separate, or?
So when we talk about the question is whether there's one Buddha mind or are all the Buddha minds separate, His Holiness the Dalai Lama in the Path to Bliss, I think he talks about this a little bit. He can say that we can say from the vantage point of your individual mind ripening all the way into Buddhahood means that you have a distinct mental continuum that continues through Buddhahood. Because in fact, as His Holiness says in that book, the beings that you will most immediately benefit are the beings you have a karmic connection with. So that means that's different than the other Buddhas that have already come into Buddhahood, that are manifesting and continuing to benefit sentient beings in their own way. So we can say there is an individual track that is June's mind in this life, that will be some other person's life in the mind in the next life, and so on until you attain Buddhahood. That is that stream of consciousness that ripened into omniscient mind. At the level of those omniscient minds, though, there's not a lot to distinguish them in terms of you wouldn't have less qualities than Buddha Shakyamuni's mind or Buddha Maitreya's mind or any other Buddha's mind. All Buddhas have the same qualities of mind. So in that way, they're a bit indistinguishable, and they all are omniscient, so they all know all phenomena. Again, the only differentiation would be that you would be manifesting your mind based on the beings in particular that you have strong karma with. And that would be the most immediate way that there would be a differentiation between your mind and other minds. as time goes on, I imagine that you're just part of the overall enlightened mind force that is happening in worlds.
Okay, that's what I want to know.
But-
There is that mind.
But I wouldn't call it, just one mind, a mind. It is a conglomerate of all the minds, that it is enlightened activity, enlightened energy, or whatever you want to call it. But I wouldn't call it a single mind, because you never lose the continuity of a single awareness. I don't think. I don't know. I don't know the exact answer.
There's some causality even taking place in the Buddha's mind.
Well, yeah, a Buddha's mind is still an impermanent phenomenon, a caused phenomenon. On the basis of every moment of it will be different, because it is a changing phenomenon. Now it is eternal, and it is always knowing all things, but it is manifesting in different ways based on the karma of the beings that it is assisting, and so on. So, yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same issue came up when Buddha was alive.
Yeah.
Because they kept coming up and asking him, what's going to happen when you die and achieve nirvana? Are you still going to exist or not exist? Where are you going to be? And the Buddha kept saying, at one point the Buddha said, this is a nonsensical answer. And the reason it's a nonsensical answer is because Buddha kept saying there is no self. So if there is no self, there is no Buddha self.
Yeah.
So you can't say whether it exists afterwards or not, because there's no self at all, period. And so in a sense, it doesn't make, it's like the consciousness continues. That's not the same as self. And the real problem that we always get into when talking about Buddha after he achieves full enlightenment and leaves this body is that we always want to project the self onto him, even when he's enlightened.
Yeah.
And I think it's very hard for us to think about a Buddha not, what does it mean not to have the self and be this enlightened being? I think for us it's very difficult to think about that. And it sort of goes beyond our sense of being able to just think about that. So it's really, it's almost beyond our, because we're always trying to project, we always try to conceptualize everything, trying to think, what is the idea of this? And we don't have any reference for what it would be like to be in that sort of state. So it's just, you almost can't think about it.
So I'm not sure if... Well, hold on just one second, Tony. For the people at home, what Bob was sharing in brief had to do with this idea of projecting a sense of a self on the Buddha, when in the Buddha is free of all of that kind of elaboration and what have you. I mean, we can still talk about, we can impute a self and validly impute a self on the basis of the aggregates that are appearing for us that are Buddha Shakyamuni from the time of the Buddha, for example. But we, really, it's just, again, it's a conventional construct. It doesn't have anything to do with ultimate reality in terms of a Buddha's experience. That's why we call them kind of the Tathagata, the one gone to thusness, gone to that space of sort of no longer adhering to any of that necessity of any of these conventional trappings in a sense. The only reason why a Buddha knows conventionalities is to help sentient beings through the force of understanding how they are relating to the world and so on. There's really kind of no need, in the sense that Buddha is sort of completely liberated from all of that. But that's essentially, I think, what Bob was getting to. But I'm sorry, Tony. If I didn't interrupt you, I wouldn't have been able to get that to the folks at home. So,
a notion of understanding could be that Buddha neither exists nor does not. We are always stuck in this rut of it is or it is not, this and that, and we create these insane concepts, and that's why we're screwed up.
yeah.
The Buddha, as the Dhammakaya, neither exists nor does not exist. It's transcendental to absolutely everything we have ever come into contact with, have ever believed, will ever believe, because the Buddha is unbelievable, inconceivable. We have to conceive all the time. That's our trap. We can conceive of trillions and billions of universes. Still a trap. As big and as dense a trap as the conception of those stars.
Yeah, and in a sense, I mean, our concepts always refer what we're used to.
Right.
And it's beyond anything.
Right.
And it's come completely limited.
gone beyond, gone completely. Now, I want everyone to have a concept.
Right.
Because that was the movie.
Yeah.
The Buddhist movie.
So, yeah, we're getting to our time, and this is getting maybe a little outside the realm of what we want. So Tony was just sharing concepts around, the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, either not existing nor existing. I mean, so at some level, there is a transcendence that happens, certainly. But from our vantage point of kind of being conventional beings, looking at all this, we say there is a Buddha that exists. There is that thing we can nominally establish, but nothing more than that, obviously. And there's an awareness that that's based on, which is the mind of a Buddha that is the Dharmakaya, the truth body, and so on. But so here again, just pull it back to where we started this discussion, the major ramification, the major consequence, it's being set out here, and we'll look at this more in detail next week, is that if the aggregates were the self, if the self were the aggregates in an inherent way, meaning that they both are inherently one and the other, then one of the consequences is that when the aggregates arise, which would be at the beginning of this life, self would then start. When the aggregates cease at the end of this life, then self would cease. And of course, I don't think there is a problem conventionally in saying that the self changes as the aggregates change, right? We go, oh, my body's really starting to get a bit creaky, as the body changes, we think I am getting creaky. We don't just think it's the body that's getting creaky, we think I'm getting, I'm getting more feeble, or whatever the case might be. I don't want to use any words that'll offend anybody. So the idea is that we do have that strong ability to identify with all the changes of the aggregates, and there's nothing wrong with saying the self changes as the aggregates change. There's a different self in a sense than when you were 10 years old, right? Because your aggregates are different than when you were 10 years old. Your mental development, your physical development, everything. But the whole point of this, the real crux of it, is that the self would only exist for this duration of the aggregates because they're inherently one. But then what was pointing out here is that even if you go down to the minute level, though, if you say that there is this inherent existence between the self and the aggregates, then every moment there would be a new self arising on the basis of that new moment of the aggregates. And then that one would cease and you have another new self arising. But we don't have that experience at all, right? We have an experience of, I can remember when I was 10 years old, and I can remember when I was, 50 years old, and I can remember all these various points in my time because there is a continuity of the self on the basis of these aggregates. They aren't inherently distinct every individual moment. So this is one of the consequences of looking at this idea of things existing inherently. If the I existed inherently and was equivalent to the aggregates, these consequences would ensue in terms of arising and ceasing. Now, there are more that we're going to go into because I think, Tsongkhapa does talk about a few of them, and it is important to touch on them because this is a way to analyze. Another way to analyze real quickly, and then we'll conclude, is that when we do the 4-point analysis, we can also do the sort of investigation ourselves to see if we can find anything among the aggregates that is equivalent to the I in all ways, in the strong sense of I that we are adhering to. Pick the body apart and see if you can find some part of the body that is the I. Pick the mind apart mentally and try to isolate different parts of the mind and see if you can find something that is the I in that way. And then you might think, well, but the I's still here. Well, you might think it's the mind-body complex, as we've been referring to, this collection of stuff. And that's what I think even Mark was referring to sometimes, is this idea that you have all this involved. You have a whole bunch of stuff involved. Well, by virtue of that, you have more than one thing, as I was pointing out to Mark. So how can you have one I that has a collection of stuff as its basis? That will lead us to one of the other consequences that Tsongkhapa talks about. As I said earlier, if there's one I and 5 aggregates, well, then there's 5 I's, or there's only got to be one aggregate, because you've got to find something. If they are inherently existent, they're inherently one. There's no difference between them. You can't find something that is the I that isn't that aggregate, and you can't find something that is that aggregate that isn't that I. But we don't have that experience either, right? Because sometimes among these aggregates, we feel very strongly that we're identifying with the body. And we identify others. I mentioned this on Sunday. We identify others by their bodies. We don't say, oh, Bob's mind just came in the room. We say Bob came into the room. It's on the basis of his physical aggregates coming into the room, right? We don't, think in terms of a mind coming into the room, right? I mean, so we're strongly identifying ourselves and other people on the basis of their physical aggregates, the form. So how could, if it's equivalent to form in all ways, well, then there wouldn't be any mind at all. You wouldn't have any identification of you with your mind. You wouldn't have any sense of being lost in your thoughts or whatever the case might be. So again, we'll get into these more, but these are the approach that Nagarjuna takes, is to show us the consequences of our erroneous thinking so that we come to understand that, it can't possibly be this way. The self can't possibly exist in the way that my ignorance, my view of the transitory collection thinks it exists. Anyway, sorry, I'm maybe beating a dead horse here, but let's conclude and hold on to any questions you have from tonight that you didn't get a chance to ask. I don't know if there were any online that I didn't get a chance to ask or to answer. And so if you want to bring them up at the beginning of next class, we'll give an opportunity for that. Let's go to the prayer book, page 235. Let's just do the first two prayers there, dedicating for enlightenment for ourselves and all beings, and then recalling bodhicitta. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Turn to 244. On 245, there should be a prayer for His Holiness that we'll start with, that's clipped onto that page. We'll do that verse first, and then we'll do the prayer on the bottom of 244. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Lastly, just dedicate for anyone who you're holding in your heart right now, beings that you know or whose situation moves you, who are experiencing obstacles, illness, who have died or who are dying at this time, and dedicate for their welfare, thinking that by virtue of what we've done here tonight, all their suffering is removed, and they have all the conducive conditions to find true peace and happiness. And may all beings find complete peace and happiness, full Buddhahood through what we have done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. Thank you everyone online.